Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Gord McCall. I'm the Artistic and Executive Director of the Lyric Theatre here in downtown Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And I want to welcome you to tonight's presentation of Lyric Digital Stage Write Out Loud number 7. I want to thank Terry Taves and the Write Out Loud Committee for putting these wonderful authors and musicians together, along with our hosts. And you're in for a really special evening tonight. Before we begin, I want to tell you that something you may not know, that back in the terrible pandemic, the great influenza of 1918, the Lyric Theatre was a temporary hospital housing 26 patients at a time who were sick with the influenza, with the flu. And it was remarkable that they were able to help out so many patients during that time. Our building was built in 1912, so only 6 years after it was built, it was a hospital. And it made a great contribution. So it is, of course, ironic that here we are in the pandemic again. We are closed down as we were way back then. And we don't foresee the need, and this is happy news, to be a part-time hospital at this time. But we do recognize the connection between the two events and are proud that we could serve that cause back then and would happily do so again. I want to say that, as always, we are very honored and privileged and respectful of the opportunity to be on this land. This is Treaty 4 land, and we stand with all the Indigenous peoples of Treaty 4 in the spirit of reconciliation and moving forward in unity. We also stand shoulder to shoulder with all peoples oppressed that suffer violence, racism, hatred in our country and in the world. We're having very difficult times right now, and we just want to say that our spirit is with everyone, and we do not support any kind of behavior that diminishes people in any way. Now, my pleasure to welcome you to our host, Anne Hill, who will introduce you to our author, Candace Savage, and our musical interlude musician, Jacqueline Hudec. And I want you to have a great evening, and we'll see you after the event is over, and I'm sure you're going to want to rush out and buy this book. So thank you, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks.
Welcome to the Lyric Digital Stage Write Out Loud number 7, coming to you from the Lyric Theatre in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. I would like to thank the members of the Write Out Loud Committee, our granting bodies including the Saskatchewan Writers Guild, and all the staff at the Lyric Theatre for making this online edition possible. Tonight we'll be bringing you music from Jacqueline Hudec, a Saskatchewan singer-songwriter. She released her debut album entitled Prairie Girl in 2014. It was nominated for several Saskatchewan Country Music Association awards, and hopefully her soulful singing will bring warmth to us in this first flush of winter. Our author tonight is Candace Savage. Candace Savage has commented in interviews that the prairie is in her bones, and many of her books feature prairie landscapes and prairie people. The book, A Geography of Blood, is the 2020 One Book, One Province choice for Saskatchewan. If you love this presentation and want more, there is a recorded reading on the One Book program's website. Her newest book for adults is Strangers in the House, a prairie story of bigotry and belonging. Candace Savage started this book while renovating her kitchen in Saskatoon, and in it uncovered the breadth of Canadian history in all of its complexity. With such a wide range of knowledge, Candace Savage is a multiple award winner, including the Hillary Western Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction. And when she's not writing novels, she's a member of the Saskatoon Fiddle Orchestra and chairs the Wild About Saskatoon's Nature City Festival. I hope you enjoy the evening.
Hello, Candace Savage here, beaming to you directly from Saskatoon. I would so much rather be there with you, but since that isn't possible, I'm very grateful that we can make a connection in this way. So a huge thank you to Terry and Anne and the other people at Write Out Loud, and to Gord at the Lyric for making this happen. This is number 7 in the Lyric Digital Theatre series, and that's a real accomplishment. I'm also grateful to the Saskatchewan Writers Guild for their support of this program, and to my partner Keith Bell, who is helping me make this video. What you're seeing now is our 4th attempt. The first one was scuttled by budgies, the second by a phone ringing, the third by a dog barking, and so this time we are just going to carry on. If chaos ensues, so be it. There is one advantage to making this presentation in this way, meeting with you in this way, and that is that we are now on location, because the house in which I'm sitting, my home, is also the setting for the book that I want to tell you about. The book is this one. It's called Strangers in the House, a prairie story of bigotry and belonging. And it centers on the first family to live in this house. So by way of introduction, I would like to read you just the first few pages from the opening chapter of the book. And this chapter is called Little House. It begins with a couple of lines from a poet named Jean-Guy Pillon. They go like this. Toute saison embellit la maison de nos amours. Each season embellishes the house of our love. For almost half a lifetime, going on 30 years, I have lived with my family in an unassuming wood-framed house in a quiet city on the northern edge of the Great Plains. 5 minutes' walk to the west lies the shining, low-slung valley of the South Saskatchewan River, with a view across the water of downtown Saskatoon and the fairy tale silhouette of the Bessborough Hotel. My young daughter and I were lucky enough to arrive here in springtime on a big, blue, blustery day when the trees were juicy with new leaf green. I can still remember the sappy joy we felt the first time we walked down our street, amazed by the extravagance of this welcome. That was 1990. We had landed in Saskatoon following a 5-year stopover in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, an excellent place in its own way, but not exactly a garden city. In Saskatoon, we found ourselves 10 degrees of latitude farther south, though still technically in the subarctic climate zone. To us, however, our new surroundings were exuberantly tropical. What's more, our surge of elation reassured us that we were truly home. Diana had begun her life in Saskatoon, and now she was back on the cusp of her 11th birthday. I was a stubble jumper too, but that is a longer story. Diana and I had left when she was a toddler, following the sudden death of my husband, her dad. Despite the best of medical intervention, he had succumbed to a runaway infection at the age of 32, the kind of thing that almost never happens these days, but happened to him. Ever since, I had been reeling, spinning Diana along in my wake, and now, finally, we were ready to settle, to find our way back again. This time around, home was to be the ordinary bungalow that anchored the corner of the block. Like most of the dwellings on our street, our house qualified as what is known in real estate jargon as a character home. In other words, it was old. It was drab as well, sided in white painted boards, accented with gloomy brown trim. And although I didn't see it that way at the time, in obvious need of care and attention. The carpets were worn and dingy, the ancient clawfoot tub in the bathroom scarred and stained with rust. The cupboards in the kitchen had been repurposed from somewhere else and might have appeared to other eyes as makeshift. But to me, these notional deficiencies were all selling points. The last thing I wanted was a jewel box that had to be protected from a child with a soldering iron in her hand or rollerblades on her feet. We needed a place that could cope with the rough and tumble of real living. But of course, that wasn't the whole story. I didn't fall in love with the house just because it was comfortably worn in. There was something else, a je ne sais quoi, that instantly made me feel welcome here. Perhaps it was the light that fell trembling on the sidewalk that led to the front door, the light that spilled into all the rooms through the large, well-proportioned windows, the prismatic glint that was caught by the old glass knobs on the bedroom doors. Modest as it was, the house had been built with pride, perhaps even with love. Its wide baseboards and solid fir door jambs spoke of generosity and connection. Like the trees along the boulevard, the house was rooted in place, as I longed to be. In the days I'd spent packing all our worldly belongings into boxes in preparation for the leap south, I had been surprised, time and again, by a wordless daydream in which a gigantic spruce tree plummeted out of the sky, crash-landed out on the prairies, and hurried to push down roots. A spruce tree on the prairie? That doesn't make any sense. Why couldn't I be a clump of blue grama grass or a wild sunflower instead? After all, prairie plants are famous for their strong, deep systems of roots. I'm a little prairie flower, went an old song that my mum used to sing to me, growing wilder by the hour. Well, that was more like it. Yet, incongruous as the image was, there was no mistaking its meaning. I had come home to stay. And what would those roots do as they pressed fiercely into the earth? For roots are not mere holdfasts, they are seekers, and there is no way of foretelling how deeply they will reach. We'd been living in our house happily, uneventfully, for 2 or 3 years before a stranger popped up in our midst. It was Diana who first made the connection. One afternoon, as part of a school project, she and her classmates caught the bus from Greystone Heights School, now home of the Saskatoon Islamic Association, to the downtown library. In my mind's eye, I can still see them clattering up the broad zigzag stairway to the second floor and elbowing through the doors of the local history room. That evening, she returned home bearing a scrap of paper on which she had written in a careful penciled hand a list of all the heads of household ever to have lived at our address, with the dates they'd first moved in. This information she had extracted, year by year, from the library's comprehensive collection of civic directories. With a disregard for privacy that makes the digital present look prim, these volumes provide a permanent, publicly accessible record of names, addresses, occupations, and affiliations, extending back, in the case of Saskatoon, to the early 1900s. The series ceased publication around the turn of the millennium, overtaken by concerns about our see-through online identities. The final entry on the list, the most recent, was the first to catch my eye. 1990, it read, Savage, Candace. Look at that. Just by showing up, I had earned a place in the history books. Above that momentous entry, 8 other occupancies stepped back through the decades, with 2 in the 1980s, 1 in the 1970s, and then a single long tenancy that stretched all the way back to the 1940s. Savage Candace will have to hang on until the end of her days to break the previous record for continuous residency. Another 3 notations rewound the tape through World War II and the Depression of the 1930s. Apart from my own, the names were all male, a fact that was irritating but unsurprising given the overall invisibility of women in the historical record, and completely inscrutable. who knew who these guys might have been, and who cared, really? But there was one entry that gave us pause, the very first one on the list. Built 1928, it read, Blondin, Napoleon S. Nothing before that, Kidlet? No, really, Mum, I checked. There wasn't anything here, not even an address until 1928. So the first family here was French? So there was the first mystery that led to the creation of this book. Being French turned out to have been a very consequential difference. And after the musical interlude, we'll come back and explore what those consequences were.
Hi there, my name is Jacqueline Hudec, and I'll be doing a few songs off of my Prairie Girl EP for you. I'd like to welcome you to the Lyric Theater Digital Write Out Loud Series number 7 with Candace Savage. And this song I'm going to do for you is called Not Quite There. Riding quiet morning, heading out of town. The trunk is overflowing, leaves are turning brown. The chill in the air is good on my face. Looking for roadside, just trying to find my place. Talking in circles, dizzy from the night before. Thoughts keep spilling over, the sound of slamming doors. Take a deep breath, I'm tired of this game. Guess I'll keep driving, forget about the pain, 'cause I'm not quite I'm not quite there. The moments that I live for, and some I just live through. Trying to find the music in the pain. Moments that I cling to. Memories of you, I'm not quite there. I'm not quite there. Road keeps getting longer, there's no end in sight. My eyes have grown weary, stop for the night. Signs pointing nowhere, I'm trying to make it through. And if home is where the heart is, we head on to you. But I'm not quite there. I'm not quite there. This is called Let It Rain. This old house is flooding with my tears. It's wearing down the foundation. gotta wait this out. Rainbows gonna glow and shadows disappear. But for now, let it rain and wash it away. Let it rain, wash it away. Let it rain, wash it away. Let it rain. This song is called Prairie Girl. Heading down the highway, name on the marquee. It was all I could think about. Left that little town to chase my big dream. Seems like a lifetime ago. And I'll always be a prairie girl, no matter where I roam. The thought of you and the sky so blue got a way of bringing me home. Met a sweet mountain man, he swept me off my feet, and the gypsy swore he'd break my heart. His heart was young and wild, and I knew my face, but the thought of him kept burning in my soul. And I'll always be a prairie girl, no matter where I roam. The thought of you and the sky so blue got a way of bringing me home. Open road, prairie towns keep calling me back to you. Ooh, yeah. Woke up this morning, I was far from home, and the mountains are closing in on me. Can't see the sun, I'm not sure where I've been, but I think I'm ready to run. 'Cause I'll always be a prairie girl, no matter where I roam. The thought of you and the sky so blue got a way of bringing me home. I'll always be a prairie girl, no matter where I roam. The thought of you and the sky so blue got a way of bringing me home. Bring me back home.
if I were able to be there, I would be asking Jackie Hudec if she is related to my old friend Dorothea Hudec, who I knew, wow, who's counting, but a very long time ago here in Saskatoon. I'm sure you're related. We'll have to catch up on that another time. Meanwhile, I'd like to continue introducing you to the family of Napoléon S. Blondin, as it turned out, Napoléon Sureau de Blondin. To understand why that name struck us so forcefully, why we didn't ever forget entirely after that moment when Diana came home with the little list. This little list, this is what happens when you're a pack rat. You have to know a little bit about the history of Saskatoon. You need to remember that this place was first started in the 1880s as a temperance colony by God-fearing Protestant people from Ontario with very strong imperial loyalties. And so all the streets around here are named for members of the British royal family. So we have Albert and Victoria and Lansdowne, and on and on and on it goes. So this place was mapped out as being part of the British Empire and a place for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people to live upright lives. In Saskatoon, people who were marked with ethnicity as others were supposed to live on the other side of the city, where the subdivisions had been set up on less generous lines, no public reserve for parks, nothing like that. Whereas this part of Saskatoon on the east side of the river was supposed to be a garden city, bringing the virtues of the countryside into urban people's lives. So how had these Blondins managed to establish themselves in this part of town? They started digging around, doing, all that online genealogical stuff. And, began to make some connections. So it was pretty confusing. But the best thing that happened was that because I was leaving little questions here or there, and someone noticed. And one day, out of the blue, an email popped up in my inbox that said, I see you've been doing some research about my wife's grandfather. And so not long after that, I found myself in touch with two of Napoléon Sureau de Blondin's granddaughters living in Regina. They came, of course, they had heard that their grandfather had built a house in Saskatoon, and they knew that he had lost it. But they didn't know that he'd lost it in the Depression of the 1930s. But they'd lost track of it. They didn't know where it was anymore. So they were really excited to make this connection with this crazy woman who was trying to find out what the story of the family was. And they came for a visit. And with them, they brought photographs. They brought a photograph of this very house when it was being constructed. These treasures in their family album. They brought a photo of their dad and a brother and sister in the boulevard outside the house. It was so exciting. And I had some things that I was able to show them too, because after Keith arrived in our lives, we did some renovations, as people will do when they're setting up household together. And when we tore out the walls in the kitchen, there's this great storm of shavings, you know, the material that had been put in the walls as some attempt at insulation. And in and amongst that were all kinds of flotsam and jetsam. There were bits of Valentine cards. There was a box from sort of plasticine stuff, collar from a man or a boy's shirt, arithmetic homework, a fancy card from a wallpaper shop. There was even a negative from a photo, all ghostly, black on white. And it took me a long time to realize that modern technology being what it is, I did have the facility to be able to print this photo. Oh, I was so desperate for the granddaughters to be able to recognize the people in this photo. They weren't sure. They weren't sure, but they thought maybe their Uncle Chuck, their Uncle Chick, Charles Blondin, might be able to recognize these people. So an actual son, there was a possibility that I would be able to be in touch with the son of this family who were suddenly so fascinating to me. So by this time I'd been able to trace the family back, actually all the way to France in the 1600s. And the first member carrying that Sureau name to come to New France. The de Blondin was a nickname they picked up after they got to New France. And we could follow them through New France into Lower Canada, and then into Ontario. They settled in the 19th century in the Penetanguishene Peninsula. And then in the early 20th century, making this great leap across to Saskatchewan, where they homesteaded around Harris, accidentally, because these were people who wanted to leave their background behind. The father of the family had forsworn the Catholic Church, but they found themselves still in the company of a small French community around Tessier, and homesteaded there. And so, of course, the granddaughters had stories about the family's life there, about how the father, their grandfather Napoleon, had homesteaded, how he'd had a hardware store, all these kinds of stories, and how much they had loved this place called Crystal Beach, which is, the typical prairie lake, a small body of water with some trees around this wonderful oasis in the welcoming, dry, open grasslands of the prairie. So I'm going to read you just a little bit about Crystal Beach. There's a wonderfully odd old photo that captures the scene at Crystal Beach in those early days. In the absence of the piers and pavilions that would come later, someone has driven a team and wagon into the shallows, and half a dozen gents in fedoras and suit coats are lounging on the wagon bed, seated or standing, shoulders relaxed, momentarily at rest. A dozen other boulders are waist deep in the water, men and boys. What a man's world this was. And one guy, front and center, is submerged up to his shoulders, his head comically afloat on the glassy surface. According to the files at the museum in Harris, a mecca for anyone curious about the town's history, that swimming figure is a Blondin. Though which Blondin, it does not say, because the family had arrived en masse, father, mother, or stepmother, sons and daughters. But I remember seeing a print of the same photo in granddaughter Lorena's album with an arrow and a handwritten label from an earlier generation that identify him as Dad. Everything in the photo, even the team of horses, seems to be holding its breath. There is no wind, the lake shimmers in the sunshine, and Napoleon Blondin's face beams with contentment. Come to think of it, there's another photo that catches a similar summery vibe, the one that came tumbling out of our walls in Saskatoon. When I bring the image up on my computer for a closer look, I'm amazed by what I see. The photo was clearly taken at Crystal Beach. The sheen of the water, the reedy edge, the encircling shade of trees, all now familiar to me. Even the building in the background, a feature I hadn't really noticed before when I'd considered the photo earlier, is recognizable from other views of the place that I've seen at the Harris Museum. And having established the location, I can fix the date as well. The women's ankle-length skirts and updos suggest a time before World War I. There is no trace of the flappers' sassiness about them. As for the vehicle they are leaning against, Dr. Google informs me it is a McLaughlin Buick Mogul Model 8 touring car, circle 1910. On the right side of the image, a man with Napoleon Blondin's strong features stands at ease, hands thrust in his pockets, shirt open at the neck, a flicker of contentment softening his gaze. If only I could step into the picture, introduce myself, and warn him about what is coming next. Has he heard that the loyal Orange Lodge has set its sights on Harris and is heading for Crystal Beach? Orangism had arrived in the Goose Lake country with the earliest Anglo settlers, though at first it was more of a tendency than an organized force. That changed around 1910, just after the Blondins had arrived, when the Grand Orange Lodge of Saskatchewan hired a man named William Henry Grattan Armstrong, a native of County Armagh, as a full-time professional organizer. As Armstrong would report to his brothers at their annual convention in Saskatoon the following spring, he was not one to spare himself. With true missionary zeal, in just 12 months, he had traveled 17,744 miles, initiated 172 members, advanced many others ceremonially through purple, blue, and scarlet degrees, delivered dozens of public lectures, written hundreds of letters, and founded 36 new local associations, all in Saskatchewan. All of this, as he explained, was to further the great and glorious principles we Orangemen profess, the maintenance of Protestantism and the transmission to posterity of the priceless heritage of freedom purchased for us by the lifeblood of our ancestors at Derry, Aughrim, Inniskillen, and the Boyne. As the result of his prodigious and patriotic efforts, the Orange Lodge was now established in 126 communities across the province, up from around 50 just 5 years before, with a total strength of some 3,000 members, and certainly Swift Current was amongst those 126. As the Goose Lake railway line pushed westward from Saskatoon, it opened up new territory to Brother Armstrong's proselytizing zeal. Wherever he stepped off the train, at Delisle, Laura, or Tessier, at Harris, or the nearby rural communities of Valley Centre, down the line at Zealandia or Rosetown, a new lodge sprang up in his wake, with its own right worshipful master and regular meeting date. Local 2014 in Harris chose the first Thursday of the month, later, portentously, the first Saturday after the full of the moon. Membership was only open to the highest type of men. No blasphemers, no drinkers, and of course, no papists. Anyone who was a Catholic, had ever been a Catholic, or had married a Catholic was explicitly banned a rule that automatically excluded the entire Francophone community near Tessier and the free-thinking Blondins of Harris. More than just a social snub, this hard line could have been far-reaching, even disastrous for those outside the fold, since Orangemen were bound by an oath to stick together. In Toronto, this solidarity resulted in a dark network, complete with a secret handshake and mystic signals that focused support behind a succession of candidates for mayor and allowed the order to dominate civic politics until the middle of the 20th century. In a little town like Harris, Orange preference meant favoring one neighbor over another and could spell the end of a small operator like a pioneer hardware man. Somehow, in the face of this divisive intrusion, Napoleon had to find a way to stay friends with everyone. And perhaps that is one reason he invited the local Anglican congregation, which lacked a sanctuary of its own, to hold services in the upper floor of his hardware store. But this makeshift arrangement did not sit well with the members of the newly formed Harris Orange Lodge, who thought the Anglicans deserved the dignity of a proper church. On July 12, 1911, as a fundraiser, they hosted a celebration of the glorious 12th, the commemoration of a great Orange victory over Catholicism, on the shores of Crystal Beach, an event that was remembered long thereafter as one of the largest and best ever held in this part of the West. A local farmer in a foppish hat stood in for King William, the Protestant hero, with a saddle horse for his white steed, and the Orangemen, bright and jaunty in their embroidered collars, marched behind him as God's victorious army. By the end of the day, the lodge, with an assist from its ladies, had raised $400 through the sale of refreshments, completely teetotal, of course, enough to cover most of the cost of building the English church. People had come from miles around for a day of good, clean family fun. They'd eaten rhubarb pie and hand-churned ice cream, clapped in time with the marching songs. They'd sung the national anthem, God Save the King, with gusto. Through it all, the Orangemen had entertained the crowd with their dazzling contradictions. They were straight-laced yet showy, judgmental yet generous, dictatorial yet unstinting in their appeals to fair play and justice. And so, the loyal Orange Lodge insinuated itself into the normal round of community life, poisonous and seductive. The Loyal Orange Lodge was a ubiquitous and powerful force in the societies of southern Saskatchewan, the settler communities in southern Saskatchewan, through to the 1920s. And so this was the context in which this French-speaking, some of them still nominally Catholic, family had to survive. And I didn't know all this at the beginning. And so when I was told by the granddaughters that their grandmother, his name was Clara Blondin, Clarisse Marie Parent, who became, by choice, Clara Blondin, refused to speak French or be spoken to in French, even in her own house, I was very shocked and quite disapproving. And it took me quite a while to understand how painful it was to be excluded by language and religion in this very toxic society that existed here at the time. So the Blondins came from Penetanguishene to Harris, found themselves in this milieu, but still they prospered. They had a number of children, and finally other members of their family had bottomed out. They had not won the Prairie Gamble. But Napoleon and Clara had done pretty darn well, and they decided to sell out and move to Saskatoon. In 1926-27, they built this house in 1928. And coincidentally, that was exactly the time when the work of the Orange Lodge bore very strange fruit. So I'm just going to read you a very little bit about what happened next. The Invisible Empire, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Canada, arrived in the province of Saskatchewan in the closing week of 1926 at the behest of the organization's national headquarters in Toronto. Didn't come directly from the States, came from Ontario. Things had gotten a bit sticky for the movement in Ontario that autumn when 2 of its members were found guilty of setting dynamite in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Barrie. An ideal moment, the leadership thought, for a change of venue. Accordingly, a team of experienced operatives was dispatched to Saskatchewan. A King Cleagle, or chief organizer, named Louis A. Scott, assisted by his son Hugh, and a Clockard, or clan lecturer, named Pat Emmons. All 3 were American citizens who had previously risen to prominence as leaders of the Indiana Klan, where they had peddled an intoxicating mixture of white supremacy, xenophobia, anti-Catholic bigotry, old-time religion, and pure Americanism. So potent was their appeal that by the mid-1920s, Klan-sponsored candidates had taken control of both the state assembly and the governor's office. In 1925, however, their reign came to an abrupt end when the state's leading Klansman, Grand Dragon D.C. Stevenson, was convicted in the abduction, rape, and murder of a female civil servant. It's possible, I suppose, that word of these atrocities had not found its way to the scattered towns and cities of the Saskatchewan plains. But even if people were in the dark about the Klan's recent misdeeds, everybody knew, or should have known, about its historical infamy. The first full-length American movie shown in Saskatoon had been D.W. Griffith's epic blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation, which was screened at the Empire Theatre on 20th Street in the spring of 1916 to the accompaniment of a 20-piece orchestra. Admission was a hefty $1.50, up from the usual 25 cents. But that didn't keep the show from playing to enthusiastic audiences. As the music swelled to its martial climax, legions of robed and hooded horsemen thundered across the screen, first defeating a mob of African-American insurgents and then rescuing a white maiden from the clutches of a mixed-race man. In case anyone missed the significance of these developments, an intertitle flashed up to provide an explanation. The white race had come together in common defense of their Aryan birthright. Although the revitalized Second Klan, the movement that rode into Saskatchewan in the 1920s, had officially forsworn violence, it remained unapologetically committed to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant domination. The Klan was a religious movement, its promoters cried, motivated solely by a desire to rid society of sin, attributes that made it, in Clockard Emmons' words, the greatest Christian benevolent fraternal organization in the world today. But benevolent did not mean spineless. The Klan was tough on non-preferred immigration, tough on papist interference, tough on sectarian schools. We fed people antis, Emmons would later confess about his work in Saskatchewan. Whatever we found that they could be taught to hate and fear, we fed them. We were out to get the dollars, and we got them. No point in railing against African Americans in Saskatchewan, since vanishingly few black settlers had ever been allowed in. Similarly, even though the KKK was explicitly anti-Semitic, there was no mileage to be made by attacking Jews, since they too were few and far between as the result of official immigration policy. As for Indigenous people, they had already been swept aside and were of no further interest to Emmons or his audiences. No, what really got the crowds going in Saskatchewan was a rip-roaring sermon on a familiar Orange theme. One flag, one language, one school, the American-born organizers chorused. Keep Canada British. So the Ku Klux Klan arrived in Saskatchewan and picked up on the groundwork, benefited from the groundwork that the Orange Order had laid. And because Catholicism and the French language were closely intertwined in Canada, anti-French, anti-Catholic tropes were the message of the Ku Klux Klan. Those first American-born organizers quickly disappeared from the scene. They absconded with the thousands and thousands of dollars that they had made by signing up members all across the province, the southern parts of the province. They'd made it by selling membership, by selling gowns, all these, the terrifying costumes of the Ku Klux Klan. And then they just tore out of here. But that wasn't the end of the story, because Saskatchewan-born or Saskatchewan resident organizers picked up the themes and filled the gap and created a Saskatchewan-born, a Saskatchewan-based clan. No violence, they said, no gowns, but the message was still the same. So the Blondins and thousands of other people who were French-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, German-speaking, had to deal with this hostile environment. And once I understood this, then it no longer surprised me that Clara Blondin had made this break with her whole heritage, that the French language had become just, there were too many painful consequences to being identified as French. I did finally get to meet her son and Napoleon's son, Uncle Chick, Charles Blondin. He said he had grown up with no sense at all of having been French. So I know there are many, many family stories that are like this. Coincidentally, a friend who grew up in Swift Current was just telling me a story yesterday about his dad who had he had worked for the credit union system, and his job was to go to the small communities, French-speaking communities, Pontex, Gravelbourg, and so on in southern Saskatchewan. And my friend remembered a story his dad had told about one of the people he worked with, a francophone person, who remembered the time when the community had wanted to have a French language radio station, and a clan member had said no, this was not a good idea, and had asked the francophone man which he valued more, a French language radio station or his home. So it was pretty shocking, it was to me anyway, to understand how much bigotry was embedded in the foundational society, settler society here. So as we're thinking about the Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter movements, and all of our interest in inclusion and respect. These issues don't just live somewhere else or come from somewhere else. They're part of our heritage as well. So I read you at the beginning the opening pages of the book. I'm now going to read you the last paragraph. There's a lot more to this story. It turned out to be a very complicated and fascinating story, interwoven with the experience of Métis people as well as Francophone settlers, Franc-Saskatchewan communities. So I hope that this introduction will be enough to entice you to read the rest of the book and consider the story in all its richness. So here, in conclusion, the end. The truth. We live in a house of stories bequeathed to us by the past. It's no mansion filled with wonders. In fact, it's a fixer-upper in need of loving care. When we find cracks in the foundations and rot in the woodwork, then it's good to face up to the defects and bring them out into the light. And it's good, so good, to sit with one another and share our experiences. Stories are living things. They transcend boundaries and divisions. They seek out common grounds. There is room in our house of stories for everyone. Thank you.
Wasn't that a great evening? Thank you, Candace, for introducing us to your wonderful book, Strangers in the House. Special thanks to Jacqueline Hudec for some great music, and of course, our host, Anne Hill, for getting us underway. And to Terry and the committee, once again, you've done a great job. Before we go, I just want to say that we apparently, along with everybody else, still have a ways to go before we can reopen and life return to normal. So in the meantime, we do really appreciate your support, and we need it to keep the building open, to plan for future projects, and to cover expenses for the projects that we're doing right now, particularly the Lyric Digital Stage. You can look forward to, by the way, a couple of new ones coming up. We're going to do a Shakespeare Lyric Digital Stage, which should be a lot of fun. We're calling it All the World's a Stage. And, of course, Postcards at the Speed of Light will be coming along as well. In the meantime, if you'd like to donate to us, simply write a check or money order to the Lyric Theatre, Box 1143, Post Office Box 1143, Swift Current, Saskatchewan, S9H3X3, or if you want to make a direct deposit, an e-transfer, just make it out to treasure@lyrictheatre.ca. We so thank you for your contribution and your support. So we'll see you next time. In the meantime, blue skies ahead. It's getting a little cooler out there, but the blue skies will visit us nevertheless. We know that. All right, everybody, take care, stay safe, stay warm. We'll see you soon. Thanks.